Greetings and welcome to this training entitled Identifying Mental Health Crisis Situations in the Library. This is part of the Michigan Mental Health Training Kit sponsored by the Network of the National Library of Medicine. My name is Mark Giesler. I'm happy and privileged to be your presenter today. I'm a professor of social work at Saginaw Valley State University in Michigan. And this is sort of the culmination of work that I've done, research that I've done on the intersection between libraries and social work. So I want to share with you what we'll be covering in this two-part training. So I want to start by considering what trauma-based means as an approach to library services. And then we're going to consider the differences between what a mental health crisis is and a non-mental health crisis. That will lead us into applying that material to de-escalation techniques that can be used for both types of situations. Next, I'm going to examine some techniques suggested for encounters with individuals with specific mental health disorders. Finally, I will examine a model in preparation for thinking about real-life case studies involving patrons. That's part of the training kit. So let's start with considering a theoretical framework for approaching patron engagement, all patron engagement. This is what the literature refers to as trauma-based. I'm sure you know that historically, libraries began as agencies for social change. And one of their primary goals was providing equal access to information. In 1990, the American Library Association, spurned by library professionals in Minnesota, felt a need to make a statement about that mission. Commonly, it was called the Poor People's Policy, Policy 61. And it was designed less as a policy imperative and more as a way to raise awareness of poverty issues. This eventually became written into the ALL policy manual as B8101. That policy statement reads, "The American Library Association promotes equal access to information for all persons and recognizes the need to respond to people experiencing poverty, which includes people experiencing homelessness in the United States. Therefore, it is crucial that libraries recognize their role in supporting these communities so they may participate fully in a democratic society by utilizing a wide variety of available resources and strategies." So some of those resources and strategies referred to in the manual include promoting the removal of barriers to library and information services, promoting the publication, purchase, and accessibility of materials that focus on poverty, advocating for existing legislative efforts around these issues, finally enabling programs of training and development needed to prepare library staff to identify the needs of and deliver services to people experiencing poverty, much like the training you are viewing right now. Another way to frame the ALA directive is to say that librarians are gatekeepers. This comes from Anderson, Simpson, and Fisher in an article they published in the Journal of Poverty and Social Justice. These authors interviewed librarians in 3 states in urban areas of Ohio, Michigan, and Illinois. And among the findings they came up with, they discovered that relationships between homeless persons and library staff were generally not close, primarily because of the perceived difficulties of the unhoused. Secondly, they found that staff were overwhelmingly willing to assist, but they encountered limitations in doing so. Some of those limitations include lack of education about how to spot emotional or physical distress, lack of guidance from training or policy, so their approaches tended to be largely organic, biases and assumptions that they brought to their job, translated to, "This is beyond my job description." And finally, not being aware of referral resources for the unhoused in their communities. What's maybe the most important piece of information from this article is that the authors found that over 80% of staff indicated that they wanted to do better and learn more about servicing this population. So Anderson, Simpson, and Fisher framed the term gatekeepers, and they define them as community-based non-professionals who have more contact, perhaps, with those needing services than helping professionals. Now, why might that be? Part of this might be because they have opportunities to identify problems and provide helpful solutions. It's part of their job. Part of it might be the assumption that these are not helping professionals like therapists, which sometimes carry stigma. And therefore, the potential is there for greater trust and comfort level to be built between consumer and librarian. This sentiment, by the way, aligns with the IFLA Code of Ethics that says, irrespective of the character of their work, library and information professionals always work to benefit their users, respect them, and strive to learn more about their needs. So librarians are gatekeepers by default. And it's important then to understand a more recent term that encapsulates that gatekeeper role, and that is trauma-informed. So here is an overview of what being trauma-informed means as an institution. This comes from Anna Chiat, who's faculty at the University of Georgia School of Social Work. She says, a trauma-informed library is a place where people who have been affected by trauma are welcomed, respected, and helped to find the resources they need, where library staff are supported to understand the challenges of patrons who have experienced trauma and to respond in a positive and non-judgmental way, and where the space of the library itself conveys a message of safety and caring. It transforms the library into a place of guaranteed respect, help, and healing. It transforms the library into a place of guaranteed respect, help, and healing. Librarians are gatekeepers. Why is this important to know? And why is it important to know now? Well, Beth Waller and Sarah Johnson, in their new book, Creating a Person-Centered Library, discuss this extensively. And they remind the reader that libraries, both public and academic, are changing. One of the ways that they're changing is that they're serving a wide variety of populations that are in need. Some have always been present, others have increased in the past few years. These populations are presenting in libraries with increasingly complex psychosocial needs. Waller and Johnson make the case that shared characteristics of these patron populations can and should inform the types of programming and services offered in libraries. One of the tasks that Waller and Johnson take on is distinguishing between the needs of urban and rural libraries in this respect. Of course, with urban libraries, you have higher numbers of patrons, but there also might be other defining characteristics, city ordinances that might inhibit certain services or cause more unhoused patrons, for example, to populate the library. More violence-related behavior and incidents, actual physical emergencies within the library. But then there's also a psychological component that the authors report. Librarians want to help, but they're not sure how to, and understandably, that can be overwhelming. It can be overwhelming to not know what to do, or maybe even wondering if they can do anything at all. Now, rural libraries, according to Waller and Johnson, have many of the same stressors, but on a smaller scale. What's different here, of course, is that rural communities tend to lack the resources and the access to them, such as transportation, that urban libraries tend to have. Recent demographic research shows that rural areas have higher rates of poverty, unemployment, and lower education. Waller and Johnson also state that rural areas struggled during the COVID pandemic because of their remoteness, and they continue to struggle as they come out of it. Less vaccinated citizens and continuing technology issues, for example. Finally, there are challenges related to being the only game in town, the one-stop shop when it comes to services, which libraries often are, both in urban and rural areas. Because of those challenges, they may feel extra pressure to be all things to all people. Here is a nice summary of the top areas of psychosocial needs presented in libraries from Province et al. These needs are not restricted, by the way, to either urban or rural areas. They are present in both, the authors say. And they state that these needs aren't necessarily caused by trauma, but associated with it. Trauma serves to enhance or increase the security of these needs. So how do these stresses and strains play out in libraries? Well, here's a partial list of a snapshot of a library experiencing these stresses and strains. Librarians are seeing difficulty with social interactions, irritability, escalated behavior when unplanned things happen, more isolation among patrons, more patrons using drugs or alcohol, more patrons wanting the library to be quiet, or the opposite. Finally, inappropriate sexually themed interactions. This is the face of the modern library, whether we're talking about public or academic. And how does that affect librarians? The impact this snapshot can have on staff is significant. It can manifest in trauma experienced by librarians themselves and burnout. So 95% of urban library workers, according to the Urban Library Trauma Study, experience violence or aggression by patrons. And nearly 33% of urban library workers reported experiencing violence or aggression by their coworkers. So often that experience came from the feeling of not being supported during or after an incident with a patron, or the inconsistent or unequal application of policies and procedures. The literature labels that as institutional betrayal. And then there's secondary or vicarious trauma. Secondary trauma occurs when someone experiences trauma from exposure to someone else's trauma. And it's a common occupational hazard for those in the helping professions, including librarians. The literature shows us that secondary trauma is more likely to affect women as well, who tend to be highly empathetic in nature and unfortunately tend to have more unresolved personal trauma. Here's a framework then for a trauma-informed library as set out by Waller and Johnson. We don't have the time to discuss each one of these characteristics, but Waller and Johnson elaborate on them in their text. Safety refers to both physical safety and psychological safety. Trustworthiness, meaning the library is transparent in its decision-making processes. Peer support, where libraries minimize hierarchical structures, both among and for patrons and for staff. A collaboration and mutuality feeling. We're all in this together. A people-first approach. Empowerment, voice, and choice. Giving everyone a voice, especially those who typically don't have one, patrons and staff alike. And finally, cultural, historical, and gender issues. This is the understanding that contextual factors influence individuals' behaviors and the institution of policies and practices that reflect that understanding. So in an ideal world, this is what a trauma-informed library looks like. And when it is instituted in a facility, there are payoffs. Here's a quote from two librarians, social workers in the library, I should say, Alyssa Hardy and Jean Badalamenti. Both are interviewed in Waller Johnson's book. And they make the case that trauma-informed approaches help librarians know how to address patron behaviors. In fact, not only know how to approach it, but how to reframe it. So in their words, we come to the understanding that what may be viewed as defiance is actually something else, is actually a trauma response for this person. Librarians often take two opposite approaches to patron behaviors that stem from trauma. They either maintain strict boundaries and play it by the book in terms of policy enforcement. In other words, they ignore the trauma behind the behavior, or they have difficulty setting boundaries out of compassion for the patron. So the goal here, according to Waller and Johnson, using a trauma-informed approach, is to take a middle ground approach to problematic patron behavior. So you don't ignore the patron's needs, but you strive to understand them, the why behind the what. And only when you do that can you take appropriate action within the resources that the library has provided. So to quote Waller and Johnson, understanding trauma does not mean we eliminate or blur boundaries with patrons. Rather, it can shape how we set those boundaries. Now, we know that training that librarians receive involving patron interaction is not necessarily using a trauma-informed philosophy. So often, the primary training they receive is what is known as the information and referral approach. This is a transactional approach, defined as the active process of linking a person with a need or problem with a service which will meet the need or the problem. And I say it's transactional because it certainly works for most patrons. But Waller and Johnson force us to ask, does it work for those with complex psychosocial needs who may not comprehend or may not be able or want to follow through? For these individuals, an information and referral approach may not be effective. The authors report that in most libraries, up to 10% of staff resist any approach other than the simple information and referral approach, regardless of the patron's needs. Even in libraries where there is greater consensus about something beyond information and referral, there is disagreement on how best to do that. Should staff be trained to interact with patrons with challenging needs? Should the library bring in other professionals in the community, social workers, for example, to do so? These are ongoing and important questions that library administration staff are asking. We also know that training that librarians receive means that librarians sometimes have difficulty in setting boundaries. Librarians are generally helpful and kind, which is a good thing. But that means that some have difficulty setting boundaries, and some resist setting boundaries because they fear what could happen to them or the patron. So Johnson and Waller report incidences of librarians taking patrons home when they don't have a safe place to stay, or bringing patrons to ATM machines to withdraw money. While those are extreme examples, they reflect the fact that the boundary between being professional and personal can sometimes be blurred. And as they point out, not setting boundaries can potentially put both the patron and the librarian in harm's way. The librarian could be put in danger and or put other patrons in danger. The patron might be harmed by being rescued instead of learning to use coping skills. So enforcing boundaries certainly is not easy, and it can feel unnatural to those trained to be helpful and empathetic. In other words, it takes practice to act in a trauma-informed, compassionate manner in setting boundaries. So taking a trauma-informed approach to library services is a goal. And it's a goal that requires an awareness of what is and what isn't a mental health crisis. So the next part of the training asks that important question. I want to consider 3 topics in relation to that question. First, let's define our terms. What do we even mean by a mental health concern or crisis? Second, I want to consider stereotypes and biases that all of us bring to mental health disorders and how that might get in the way of an effective response. Third, I will consider literature that shows us what an impending crisis looks like. So the intention here is not to prepare you for every encounter that you might have with a patron, but to give you a general framework in how to approach a situation that may or may not be a mental health crisis. So let's start with an NNLM presentation entitled Providing Mental Health Resources at Your Library. In that presentation, Kennedy and Abby define what we mean by mental health crisis, mental disorder, and a serious mental disorder. So the point here is that mental health is something that all of us have. All of us go through periods in our lives where our mental health is jeopardized in some way, and it can become a crisis. We lose a pet, we get a job transfer, we lose a family member. And in that situation, or as a result of that situation, our mental health is jeopardized in some way. Our feelings, thoughts, moods, and behaviors are affected. Now, usually a condition like that is temporary, but it may not be, and it also may precipitate what would be called a mental disorder, which is usually defined as such because it is diagnosable by a helping professional. Now, just because it's diagnosable does not mean it's treated, because, as we know, often individuals do not seek out help for many reasons. And then one more distinction in defining our terms. Mental disorders differ in terms of their severity. There are some that involve serious functional impairment, and that substantially interferes with or limits a person's major life activities. Here are some stats from the National Institute of Health that give a framework for the problem and indicate the prevalence of mental health illnesses and related information. 18% of adults in the US, according to these stats, experience a mental illness. And among those adults who have a substance use disorder, 50.5% have a co-occurring mental disorder. We know that 46% of unhoused adults staying in shelters experience some form of mental illness, and 70% of youth in juvenile systems have at least one mental health condition. Finally, 60% of adults and almost 50% of youth with a mental health disorder receive no treatment. Now, one thing to note here is that this information is the pre-pandemic, and we know from other research that COVID-19 has only exacerbated this prevalence. So these are many of the people that we are seeing in both academic and public libraries today. Knowing all of that, knowing that reality, we have to ask ourselves some important questions. What is the difference between responding to a mental health crisis and responding to a mental disorder, whether it's serious or not? What is the difference between responding to a mental health crisis or mental disorder and responding to a patron's problematic or challenging behavior? Maybe the most important question, is there a difference? Is there a difference between how we respond to a mental health crisis, a mental disorder, and simply problematic or challenging behavior? Now, I want to make the case that there is less of a difference than we think. Later in this training, I'm going to share with you a model that can be applied for all encounters, however we want to define them. Still, I think it's important to distinguish in your mind the difference between these three. Knowing the symptoms and signs of mental disorders, for example, could lead you to respond in a very specific way. If you think of all mental health crises or disorders as problematic patron behavior, you're not likely to resolve the problem. You're more likely to exacerbate the conflict rather than mitigate it. Maybe a question then to ask is, what might get in the way of determining for you the difference between those three realities? And so here we're talking about stereotypes and biases regarding mental health and mental disorders. Stereotypes and biases that we all have. Again, from the NNLM presentation, one of the ways we can determine whether we're using the correct approach is by looking at our language. In our language, the language that we use, we can hear certain stereotypes and biases. So we need to generally consider the importance of a person-centered as opposed to a disorder-centered language to patrons who might frequent our libraries. So instead of thinking or saying she's bipolar, say or think she has bipolar disorder. Instead of calling someone a schizophrenic, try saying a person with schizophrenia. Instead of using the term manic depressive, which is outdated, try person with bipolar disorder. Instead of saying the mentally ill, say people with mental illness. And instead of saying he committed suicide, say died by suicide. The key is to think of person-centered language in your interactions with patrons and your discussions with colleagues about those patrons. Now, a word about implicit bias, which is something a little different and a little harder to detect and sometimes confront. Implicit biases, defined, are automatic connections stored in a person's mind outside of their conscious awareness. Anthony Greenwald is co-founder of Project Implicit, which you can find on the web. And he makes the point that people's minds work on two levels. One level is rational and deliberate, what he would call explicit, and the other operates intuitively and automatically, which he would define as implicit. So we have explicit thinking and implicit thinking. And the two levels aren't entirely independent. The conscious level, he says, works with what it receives from the unconscious level. And that is the basis for deliberate judgment and action. Now, for our purposes, this has everything to do with what is known as stigma around mental illness. And studies have shown there's a difference between explicit and implicit thoughts in regard to mental illness. One study, for example, found actually slightly positive explicit views toward people with mental illness. In another study using college students as participants, the authors found that explicit beliefs were that people with mental illness are bad and helpless, but not blameworthy. Now, what's important about these studies is that when we looked at the implicit beliefs of these participants, it found that they believed people with mental illness are bad, helpless, and blameworthy as compared to people who were perceived as normal. So we all have implicit biases. I'd encourage you to reference Project Implicit, the website. If you'd like to take some implicit bias tests on your own, or just learn more about this really important term. And as sort of a look into that website, consider the following statements. Do you see them as fact or fiction? Think about from where you received that information. The media, your upbringing. How does society perpetuate these fictions, if they're fictions? So I'd encourage you, if you'd like, to stop the video and click on the YouTube clip from PsycHub, and that will be a way to check your answers. The last word on this topic sums up the power of our stereotypes and biases nicely. We don't see things as they are, we see things as we are. The final topic I want to consider in this section is more concrete. What are some signs and symptoms that a concern might actually be a mental health crisis? When our mental health suffers, it affects our ability to think, feel, and act. But when someone is experiencing a mental health crisis, it impacts their ability to function. So on this slide, you're going to see some signs that a mental health concern could be turning into a mental health crisis. Remember that these symptoms are contextual. Signs of a mental health crisis can show up in a variety of ways and will be different for everyone. But in general, a person in crisis may have unpredictable behavior. They might have a hard time communicating their thoughts and feelings. And they may be acting in a way that could lead them potentially to hurt themselves or others. And here are some cues to consider if you know the person a bit more. They come from NAMI, the National Association of Mental Illness. This is a nationwide advocacy group for individuals living with mental disorders and their loved ones. And among the symptoms that might be important to library staff as they encounter patrons who frequent their libraries, you might notice social withdrawal. So individuals sitting and doing nothing for long periods of time, or having unusual self-absorption or self-centeredness. You might recognize, if you know the patron well, that they're exhibiting irregular expression of feelings. So hostility from one who is usually friendly or pleasant. Indifference to situations. The inability to express joy. Laughter at inappropriate times. Another cue that a person you know may be in or approaching a mental health crisis is mood disturbance. So maybe the person is showing a deep sadness, seemingly unrelated to any life event. Maybe you know that a person has loss of activities that they once enjoyed. Maybe they're expressing hopelessness, fatigue. Maybe they're thinking or talking about suicide. And finally, something to cue into if you're wondering if there's a mental health crisis are changes in behavior, hyperactivity, or inactivity, or vacillating between the two. Lack of personal hygiene, noticeable and rapid weight gain or loss, or perhaps increased drug and alcohol use. Sometimes it is quite apparent, as in the cases where you see bizarre verbal or nonverbal behavior, skipping, staring, strange posturing, for example. Or you might see someone that has an unusual sensitivity to noises or lighting. These are all cues that perhaps you need to adjust, adapt your approach, because this person might be approaching a mental health crisis. So I want to move on to the third main topic of this training, and that is de-escalation techniques. Now, I'm dividing this into two parts. Part one, I'm defining as encounters with all patrons. In part two, which will be part of the next video, I'm going to specify encounters with patrons with specific mental health disorders. Realize that there are entire trainings, some of them actually targeted for librarians, that deal with de-escalation. So I'm only giving you a glimpse here. Crisis Prevention Institute, or CPI, is one example. So the following information is a compilation of resources on this topic. Well, as usual, let's define our terms. This definition comes from the Department of Homeland Security. De-escalation is a method that is used to prevent potential violence. It is purposeful, meaning that individuals are encouraged to use purposeful actions, verbal communications, and body language with the intent to calm a potentially dangerous situation. The other important part of this definition here is the phrase without using physical force, or, and this is of course designed more for police officers and law enforcement, with a reduction in force. I think it is understood that most librarians would not resort to using physical force, but leave the situation. And I'll talk about when to leave and when not to. It's part of understanding what de-escalation is. I want to share this quotation with you that comes from Marco Vargas, who is a safety and security coordinator in Tacoma, Washington. He says, human beings, like other animals, lash out when they feel threatened. So when a vulnerable patron is escalated, that tells me that something in our space made them feel threatened or unsafe. And they probably came into our space already feeling threatened by other factors: police harassment, insults from other members of the public, predatory drug dealers, etc. Even if the patron is not part of a vulnerable population, they might be having a really bad day because of their own personal challenges that we all go through. So it's worth noting here Vargas's point about the library space as potentially contributing to the escalation. The bigger issue are the external factors that the patron may bring into the library that we may never really know about unless we engage with them. We make a lot of assumptions about our patrons. And so part of de-escalation is checking out those assumptions. Waller and Johnson write about the atmosphere and culture that libraries can create to both mitigate the need for de-escalation and enable their success if they need to be used. So part of a climate where de-escalation can work involves intentional engagement. They define that as trying to build initial rapport with everyone who walks through the door. That involves perhaps confronting some of your stereotypes and biases. They go on to talk about how doing so would pay attention to one of the epidemics of today, which is loneliness. They also talk about the need to create programs specifically with the mental health impaired and unhoused in mind, and formulating and implementing codes of conduct with the unhoused in mind and people with mental illness in mind, and getting input from those populations about those codes of conduct when possible. So this is institutional support for intentional engagement. Another part of that climate involves warm handoffs. And they define warm handoffs by making a personal referral, connecting a patron to a person rather than a resource list or a phone number. And finally, creating a climate where de-escalation can work might mean setting up processes to monitor and ensure follow-through on the referrals made. At the very least, if no staff is available, creating a referral sheet that helps patrons know how to make calls to organizations, for example. On a higher level, perhaps partnering with community organizations who actually bring their services and information on site, doing outreach to community agencies to get to know referral resources. Often the job of a social worker or a community outreach person is to do that very thing, is to do that kind of outreach. But making the efforts to build relationships, both with all patrons and also with the resources and community organizations that can help those patrons, could be well worth your efforts. Now, I want to move to thinking about specific skills used for de-escalation. And remember, we're talking about de-escalation with any type of patron. This again comes from NNLM's webinar, Providing Mental Health Information at Your Library. Kennedy and Abby suggest that approaches to any situation follow the same key guidelines. First, you respect confidentiality. If possible, you bring the patron to a quiet area. The idea of actively listening is key, both nonverbal and verbal. The webinar talks about cultural differences here in terms of this interaction. Example provided, for example, was of an interaction with an Asian American and a person from the Caucasian culture, and how eye contact actually might be difficult and different in that case. It's important to be empathetic and patient. Be prepared for an emotional reaction from the patron. And recognizing that will produce an emotional reaction in you. So part of this involves centering yourself, understanding what that emotional reaction might be in the moment. And finally, Kennedy and Abby recommend that we know the difference between providing health information and giving health advice. And they suggest stick primarily to provide health information. Don't try to interpret or explain the information. Don't share personal stories. And know who to refer the patron to if they need health advice. That's where that information and referral approach comes in handy. Here are some thoughts to de-escalation via non-judgmental listening from mentalhealthfirstaid.org. The information on this slide comes from Hannah Arata, who was in American Library Association's Public Programs Office in 2022. And she interviewed Farah Fossey, who's the lead instructor at Defend Yourself. This is an organization that conducts de-escalation training for librarians. Think of them as the 3 no's. First of all, know your library policies. Your library has policies in place that help maintain a safe environment for patrons and staff. Do you know your library's policies regarding patron interaction? Maybe more important, how consistently are those policies enforced? Know the difference between an escalating patron and one who is demonstrating inappropriate behavior. And the difference really might not matter in terms of your approach, but Arata states that not every encounter requires de-escalation techniques. Some merely require you to be assertive. So for example, if a patron repeatedly asks you personal questions, send a clear, assertive message that the behavior is inappropriate. In that case, setting a firm boundary may not require formal de-escalation techniques. But if attempts to set firm boundaries do not work, the suggestion is to use those techniques. Fossey says that knowing the difference is truly a matter of context. Is the patron a regular that you can predict his or her behavior? Did the person come to the library with the goal of being disruptive? Think about the role of security here. Is it common practice at your library to use or call security personnel? So you know your library and community best. So contextualizing the situation to know whether you need to use these de-escalation techniques and how to use them is instrumental here. So let's take a deeper look into each of these techniques. Ground yourself, get grounded. Fossey wisely states that an awareness of the situation and the stakes at hand is important. In her words, this is not the time to win an argument or to get into a power play. And most de-escalation models that you see out there have the person start with centering themselves. In other words, a purposeful demonstration of calmness and composure can truly lead to a more productive counter. When you are grounded and calm, the patron also might be grounded. There is a reason that that is the first technique that is recommended. But you also have to assess for safety. Fossey asks some questions of you. Is there a weapon present? Are you dealing with one person or are you dealing with a crowd? Where is security or outside reinforcement? And of course, it is important to know that when in doubt, you err on safety's side for you as a staff, for the patron, and for other patrons in the area. Next comes the actual engagement with the patron. 3 keywords: ask, listen, and empathize. The Moat Mental Health Services resource offers some hints about how you stand, how you position your body, and how important that is in a de-escalation situation. So the suggestion here is to stand in a not too relaxed, yet open, non-threatening position. We also have to think about what active listening means. So listening actively might mean asking the person's name. Calling that person by their name in the interaction can make all the difference in the world. Listening to the other person's message means that you're going to paraphrase it. You're going to parrot back what the person says to reach for understanding. And wherever you can, you agree. The idea is to be solution oriented, not confrontational. And if you have a solution to offer, sometimes you have to negotiate. But Fossey makes the point that you all also don't want to reward policy violations. Finally, according to this resource, you need to know when to leave a situation for your own safety. The escalated person might storm out on their own, and that's perfectly fine if that's an end to the situation. They may want to lodge a complaint. You should allow them the resources to do that. Or ideally, and if you do these steps, it's likely that the person will calm down. Whatever happens, though, be conscious of when you might have to leave a situation for your own safety. Chris Westphal has produced a video that I want to encourage you to view called 5 Simple Words: How to Diffuse a Difficult Situation in Just 5 Words. This short video clip reminds us that our state of mind during these encounters is key to their being successful. So those 5 words, what else can this mean? Checking our assumptions and then asking, what else can this mean in reference to a patron's behavior can make all the difference. I want to end this portion of the training and this first video with some specific verbal de-escalation techniques and then nonverbal. So again, words have power. The words you use or don't use can make all the difference in a de-escalation attempt. So what would it mean to say, I can see you're upset, instead of calm down? Usually when we tell a person to calm down, they do quite the opposite. What about, I can't help you, as opposed to, I want to help, what can I do? Even if you can't do anything, the indication that you are wanting to help the person can make all the difference. Not saying I understand, because usually we don't, but to say, I didn't realize this about you. Of course you are angry, upset, sad. Not saying, come with me, but can I speak with you over here? Subtle differences in language can make a difference. And acknowledging that there is concern and worry, and to reflect that. Sounds like you're concerned. Let's talk about it. You want to be sparse with issuing threats. Imagine what saying, stop that or I will call the police, will do to a situation. That doesn't mean you can't set firm boundaries. So a better way to say that, if you keep doing that, I'm going to have to ask you to leave. Finally, we can think about the way we're presenting non-verbally. Instead of standing rigidly directly in front of the person, try to keep a relaxed and alert stance off to the side of the person. Pointing your finger can escalate a situation, but keeping your hands down, open, and visible at all times might de-escalate it. Excessively gesturing or pacing, as opposed to using slow, deliberate movements. And finally, how are you being perceived in terms of your facial expressions? Faking a smile usually can be perceived, but maintaining a neutral and attentive facial expression might produce a better result. So there is no cookie cutter approach to de-escalation, but hopefully these techniques, both these verbal techniques and nonverbal techniques, will create a situation where everyone, including you, is kept safe. Now, in part 2 of this training, I will get more specific about how to use these techniques and others with patrons with specific mental health crises.